The kitchen table came out of the door of Wickenholt Farm at 7 o'clock in the morning on the 6th of April, in the year 1820, and it came out on its side, because the two men carrying it had been told to be quick and nobody had troubled to take the legs off. It caught the door frame once and took a long pale scar out of the oak, and the sound of it going was the first thing the parish of Bramfold heard that morning, before the rooks were properly up. Hester Ray heard it from the dairy, where she had gone at 5, as she had gone at 5 every morning of her life, and she came out into the yard with her sleeves still pushed back over her forearms, and stood in the middle of her own gravel, and watched her father's table carried past her, and sat down in the mud of the lane with its 4 feet in the air. She was 24 years old. She had been born in the room above that kitchen, in the bed that came out next, and she had never, in her life, slept a night anywhere else. There was a hard blue April sky over the whole valley, and the light came across the yard the way it comes only in the first week of April, low and clean and pitiless, and it showed every crack in the plaster and every chalk mark the Vallier had put on her furniture the day before. He had gone round the house on the Wednesday with a stub of blue chalk in his hand, and he had marked everything in it: the table, the settle, the 8 chairs, the clock, the corner cupboard, the churn, the beds, the 2 brass pans and the meal ark, and against each thing he had put a figure in a little ruled book, and he had not once looked at her while he did it. Wickenholt was 311 acres of the best land in that part of the county, and it lay along the south bank of the brook, with the parish of Bramfold on one side of it, and the deer park of Ambersley Court on the other, and the Rays had held it, father and son, for 91 years, without a written agreement of any kind, on nothing in the world but the custom of the country and a handshake, renewed every Michaelmas, with whichever man the Duke of Ambersley happened to be employing that year. That was the whole of it. That was how 9/10 of England was farmed then, and it worked for 91 years, and it stopped working in one afternoon in the September that had just gone, when a letter came down from the estate office at the court telling Thomas Ray's daughter that her occupation of the home farm would determine at the 6th of April next, and that his Grace intended to take the land into his own hand. Her father had been 2 winters dead by then. He had gone out on a January night to a heifer in trouble, and had come back in at 4 in the morning, wet through to the shoulder, and had never after that got his breath properly, and by the 2nd week of February he was in the churchyard at Bramfold, under a flat stone with his own father, and Hester had gone on with the farm, because there was nothing else on the earth to be done with it. She had gone on with it well. That was the part nobody at the court ever put in writing. She had carried the whole of the last harvest in 11 days, with the weather breaking behind her the entire time. She had paid the Michaelmas rent to the day, and the Lady Day rent to the day. She had put 14 acres of the bottom ground into wheat, when everybody in the parish told her it would drown. And it had not drowned, and she had sold it for the best price paid in that market in 2 years. None of it was any use to her at all. The letter did not say that a woman could not hold the home farm of a great estate. It did not need to say it. Everybody who read it understood it perfectly, and the estate had the law entirely on its side. Because there was no lease, there had never been a lease, and a tenant from year to year with no writing to show has exactly as much right to the ground under her feet as the man above her chooses to allow her, which in the spring of 1820 was none at all. They brought her mother out at 7:30, Anne Ray was 58 and lame in the left hip since a fall in the rickyard 11 years before, and she came out on the arm of the carter's boy and was set down on one of the chalked kitchen chairs in the lane facing the house, with her shawl over her knees and her hands folded on top of the shawl, and there she sat for the whole of the rest of that morning, and did not say one word to anybody. It is a particular thing to see an old woman sitting on a kitchen chair in a public road, and every soul who came up the lane that morning saw it, and not one of them ever forgot it. Mr. Josiah Seneck came at 8 in the estate's own gig, and got down and stood with his back to the barn, where he could see both the house door and the road. He was 39, a small, neat, sallow man who had been a solicitor's clerk in the county town, and had come to the Duke of Ambersley 8 years before to put the accounts of the estate into a better order, which he had done thoroughly and without mercy. He wore black. He always wore black. He had a leather-covered rent book under his arm, and when he had looked at the furniture in the lane for a moment, he opened it and read out, in a clear voice pitched to carry across the yard, the account between the estate and the late Thomas Ray and his representatives, the valuation of the away-going crops, the deduction for dilapidations to the great barn, the deduction for the gateposts at the bottom ground, the deduction for 11 perch of wool, and at the end of it, a balance in favor of the estate of $194, which he said he would take in the stock. There were about 30 people in the lane by then. 2 of them were gentlemen. They had ridden over from the court, because a turning out is a thing to see, and they sat their horses at the top of the lane with their hats pushed back. And when Mr. Seneck came to the 11 perch of wall, one of them laughed out loud, and the other said something to him from behind his glove, and they both laughed, and the sound went the whole way down the lane to where Anne Ray sat on her chair. Hester Ray walked over to Mr. Seneck and asked him one question, and she asked it quietly, because she had made up her mind in the dairy at 5 o'clock that morning that whatever else happened, she was not going to give the estate the satisfaction of a scene. She asked him whether the Duke knew that her mother had been carried out into the road. Mr. Seneck shut the rent book on his finger and looked at her for the first time that morning, and he said that his Grace was not concerned in the removal of furniture, and that she must understand that in a business of this kind her own feelings were of no consequence whatever, and that the estate had been more than fair with her. Then he said the thing she carried about with her for the next 12 weeks, and he said it not unkindly, but as a man explaining an obvious matter to somebody slow, that she was not, and never had been, a tenant of the Duke of Ambersley. Her father had been. She was her father's daughter, and there was no place for her in the estate's books at all. The Duke himself came at 9. He came down the lane at a walk, with the 2 gentlemen behind him, and the whole lane went quiet, and every man in it pulled off his hat, including the 2 who were carrying the corner cupboard. He was 42 years old, a tall, clean-shaven man with black hair, going grey at the temples and pale blue eyes, and the flat, unhurried manner of a person who has never once in his life had to explain himself to anybody. And he drew up at the gate of his own farm and looked at the furniture standing in the mud of the road with a faint, puzzled distaste, the way a man looks at something untidy that has been put in the wrong place. Then he looked at the young woman standing on the gravel in a patched grey gown, with her sleeves pushed back and her chin up, And he turned his head and said to Mr. Sennick, quite clearly, in the hearing of everyone present, "Who is the woman?" And Mr. Sennick said, "Nobody, Your Grace." "She is nobody, the late tenant's daughter." And the Duke of Ambersley said, "Ah," and gathered up his reins, and rode on through his own gate to look at his own wheat, and that was the entire sum of what passed between those two people on the 6th of April, and it was the last word spoken to her by anybody out of the court for 11 weeks. The rain came on at 2 in the afternoon, as it does in April, out of a clear morning, and all at once, and it caught the last of the furniture standing in the lane. They got the beds into Hedges' wagon, and the clock under a rick sheet, and Mrs. Kerridge, who was the saddler's widow, and had a room and a half over the shop in Bramford Street, took Anne Ray in, and set her by the fire with her feet on the fender, and did not ask anybody for anything, which was the single act of kindness done to that family that day, and was remembered accordingly. Hester walked the mile and a quarter into the village behind the wagon, with the rain coming straight down onto her uncovered head, and when she got there, the wagon could not be unloaded because the yard was full, and she was told to wait for the carrier, and there was nowhere in the whole of Bramford for a turned-out woman to wait out of the wet except the porch of the church. So she went into the porch. It was a deep old stone porch, with a bench of worn stone down either side, and a broad flagged floor, and she had been going in and out of it since before she could walk. For christenings, for harvest, for her father's burying, for 200 Sundays. And she had never once looked at the wall above the bench, because nobody ever looks at the wall of a place they have been going into all their lives. She sat down on the stone bench with her wet gown sticking to her knees and her hands dead cold in her lap, and nothing whatever to do. And she looked up, because there was nothing else to look at. And there it was. It was a benefaction board, and if you have ever been inside an old English parish church, you have walked past a dozen of them without reading one. A great flat panel of oak, 5 feet by 4, painted dead black and lettered in gold, with a painted border of gold rope round the edge and the date of its last repainting in the corner. This one hung on the west wall of the porch of Bramford Church at the height of a tall man's eyes, and it had hung there since 1691, and it had been cleaned and gone over by the churchwardens in 1788, and it was the largest piece of writing in the parish, not the smallest. That is the thing to hold on to about the whole of what follows, and it is the thing that made a king's council in a hired room at the county town go a dull red to the ears in the July of that year. There was nothing hidden about it. It was not in a bundle, it was not in an office, it was not in small type at the foot of a printed form. It was 2-inch gold capitals on a black ground in the public porch of a public church, over the heads of every soul in that parish every Sunday of their lives. And the reason nobody had read it for 8 years was not that it was concealed. It was that it was furniture, and Hester Ray, who had nothing else to do for 40 minutes on the 6th of April, with her mother's chair standing empty out in the rain, read it. It said, "To the glory of God, and for the poor of this parish forever. Simon, 2nd Duke of Ambersley, of his own free gift, by his deed-bearing date the 14th day of June, in the year of our Lord 1691, hath, charged his farm, called Wickenholt, and all the lands and appurtenances thereof, with the yearly sum of $31, to be paid at this porch upon Whitsun Monday, and upon no other day, and there laid out in bread and in firing, and given to the poorest householders of Bramford, by the hand of the tenant of the said farm, before the face of the parish. And if the said yearly sum shall at any time be behind and unpaid by the space of 40 days next, after any Whitsun Monday, then it shall be lawful for the vicar and the churchwardens of this parish, and they are hereby required, to enter upon the said farm called Wickenholt, and to take and to hold the same, with all its rents, issues, and profits, until every Whitsun so withheld shall be made good at this porch, upon Whitsun Monday, and upon no other day. God save the poor of Bramford. She read it twice. Then she got up off the bench and stood in front of it with her wet hair down her back, and read it a third time, out loud, slowly, the way her father used to read the market prices. And when she came to the name of the farm, the second time, she put her hand flat on the board over the word Wickenholt, and left it there. She knew what it was. Everybody over the age of 20 in Bramford knew what it was, and half of them had eaten it. It was called the Wickenholt bread, and until she was 16 years old, it had happened in front of her every Whitsun Monday of her life. At noon on Whitsun Monday, the tenant of the home farm came down to the church porch with a handcart, and on the handcart were 62 quartern loaves in 2 long baskets, and a load of faggots tied in bundles of 10, and the poor of the parish came for them in the order they stood in the churchwarden's book, and the tenant handed the bread out with his own hands, 1 loaf to a house, and 2 to a house with more than 4 children in it. And the old women were served first, and sitting down. That was the whole ceremony. It took 40 minutes. There was no sermon in it, and no charity dinner, and no gentleman looking on from a carriage, and that was exactly what the second Duke had intended in 1691, because the second Duke of Ambersley had come back from a bad winter, in which the parish had fed his own people when the court could not, and had wanted the debt paid in the plainest possible way every year forever by the man who held his best land, in the doorway of the church, where nobody could dress it up. Thomas Ray had given it out for 26 years. His father had given it out before him. Hester had walked beside the handcart from the time she was 4, and had been allowed to carry the tally book at 9, and had handed the loaves over herself from the age of 13, standing on the second step of the porch, because she was small, and she could still have told you the order of the first 15 names in that book without looking. Widow Dance. Widow Stollard, the blind man Pargeter, and his sister. Old Mrs. Teal at the end of the row. It stopped in the summer of 1812. It did not stop with a quarrel or a refusal or anything anybody could have taken hold of. It stopped because Mr. Josiah Sennick, in his first 6 months at Ambersley Court, went through the estate's outgoings with a ruler and a pen, found in the Whitsun quarter an item of $31 entered every year in the same words since the reign of King William, and could not find a lease, covenant, bond, or rent charge in the estate office to support it. The deed of 1691 having gone into the fire with the old muniment room in 1776. And what was left of it in the parish was a painted board in a church porch, which is not the sort of thing that gets into a steward's schedule. So Mr. Sennick drew his ruler through the item, and wrote in the margin, in the small upright hand that fills the Ambersley books from 1812 to 1820, an ancient and unsupported payment, discontinued, $31 a year. It is worth stopping on that figure, because everything that happened afterwards came out of it, and nothing else. $31 was less than the estate paid in a year for candles in one wing of the court. It was not a scandal, and it was not a theft, and no gentleman in the county would have thought about it for 2 seconds. It was simply the smallest reasonable saving that a careful new man could make in his first summer, and Mr. Sennick made it, and turned the page and forgot it entirely, and it went on being forgotten in that office for 8 years, while it quietly ripened into the ruin of the whole arrangement. When the parish came down to the porch at noon on Whitsun Monday in 1813, Thomas Ray was standing there with the handcart and the loaves as usual, and he gave them out as usual, and he never told anybody in Bramford that he had paid the baker himself out of the money he had put by for a new wagon. He did it again in 1814. In 1815 he could not do it because the wheat had gone to nothing after the peace, and he had a hard year in front of him, and he went down to the porch at noon all the same, and stood there with his hat in his hand, and told the 14 people who had come that there would be no bread that Whitsun. And old Mrs. Teal said, "Never mind, Thomas," and went home. And when Widow Dance walked up to the estate office in the June of that year to ask about it, Mr. Sennick came out to the step himself and told her quite civilly that the charity had been inquired into and was found to have no legal existence, and that the parish would oblige him by not applying again. Hester Ray went to the vicarage on the 8th of April with the words of the board copied out on the back of a bill for harness, and the Reverend Mr. Lydiard read it through twice at his own table, and then took his spectacles off and rubbed the marks they had made on either side of his nose, which was what he did instead of saying no. He was 71, and had held the living of Bramford for 34 years, and the living was in the gift of the Duke of Ambersley, and his glebe, his tithe composition, the new roof on his chancel, and the coals that came to the vicarage door every October all came out of the same house on the same hill. He said that it was a very old board. He said that boards of that kind often recorded charities long since merged, released, or bought out, and that the estate had no doubt satisfied this 1 year ago in some other form. He said that the parish must be careful not to make itself ridiculous, he said. Finally, and he was ashamed while he said it, and she could see that he was, that he did not think the vicar of Bramford could properly enter upon 311 acres of his Grace's land on the strength of a piece of painted oak, and that she was a young woman in great trouble, and should be careful not to let her trouble make her unjust. And Hester said, "No, sir, not on the strength of the board. On the strength of the deed the board copies." And Mr. Lydiard said, "My dear, where is the deed?" Nathan Ruddock was the other kind of man. He was 54, a wheelwright, the churchwarden chosen by the parish rather than the one nominated by the vicar, with a shop at the bottom of Bramford Street and 8 generations of the same trade behind him. And he did not owe the court a farthing, and had never in his life been afraid of anybody with a title. He heard her out standing up with his apron on and both hands on the bench, and when she had finished, he said one word, which was chest, and reached his coat down off the nail. The parish chest at Bramfold stood at the west end of the north aisle, an iron-bound oak coffer as long as a man, with 3 locks and 3 keys, one for the vicar and one for each warden, which is the whole reason such chests have 3 locks. Ruddock had his key on him. Old Simon Trant, the parish clerk, who was 81 and had written the parish books for 40 of those years, kept the second, because the second warden that year was the Duke's own bailiff, and had never once come to a vestry, and had handed his key to the clerk to save himself the trouble. And Mr. Lydiard, who could not bring himself to enter upon anybody's land but who was not, in the end, a dishonest man, came down the aisle at 4 o'clock that afternoon, with the 3rd key in his pocket, and turned it in the lock, and then went and sat in the chancel with his back to them, and let them look. What was in the chest was the churchwarden's accounts of the parish of Bramfold, in 22 vellum-bound volumes, running without a break from 1644 to that present year. They found it at the 7th volume, received of his Grace's steward upon Whitsun Monday, for the bread and the firing of the poor, according to the gift of the second Duke, $31. It was there in 1692. It was there in 1693. Ruddock read the entries out, and Hester wrote down the year of each one, first on the back of the harness bill, and then on a sheet of the clerk's own paper, and old Trant sat on the chest itself with a candle, and turned the leaves for them, and it took them until 9 o'clock at night, with the church quite dark round the ring of candlelight. And when they had finished, they had counted 121 entries, in 11 different hands in 121 consecutive years, every one of them made on Whitsun Monday, the last of them made on the 18th of May, 1812, in the round schoolmasterish hand of a warden who had died since. And after that entry, there was nothing at all. 8 blank Whitsuns, with the rest of the parish business, written straight across the gap, as if the bread had never existed. Nathan Ruddock closed the 7th volume, and stood with his hand flat on the cover, and said, to nobody in particular, that a thing done every year for 121 years, by 11 different men who never met each other, is not a piece of painted oak, and that he would say so anywhere in England they liked to ask him. The letter went up to the estate office on the 11th of April over the signature of Nathan Ruddock, churchwarden, and it asked, for the poor of the parish, for the $31 due on Whitsun Monday next together, with the 8 years then in arrear. The answer came back on the 13th in Mr. Sennick's own hand, that a painted board was not a deed, and an entry in a churchwarden's book was not a deed, that the estate would answer when the instrument itself was produced, and that the office would be obliged if further applications came from the vicar rather than from a tradesman. Then, on the following Tuesday, Miss Day, Sennick did the thing that told Hester Ray she was right, although he did it for the opposite reason. He came down to Bramfold Street in the gig, and sent word to her at Mrs. Kerridge's. And when she came out, he did not get down. And he spoke to her from the seat with the reins in his hands, pleasantly, in front of 2 women at the pump, who heard every syllable. He said that his Grace was a generous man who did not care to have distressed persons about the parish. He said that there was a cottage at Ford End standing empty, 4 rooms and a strip of garden, and that she and her mother might have it rent free for their lives. and $80 in hand at Michaelmas towards their furniture, and that a place could very likely be found for her in the dairy at the court. And he said that all that was wanted was her name at the foot of a short paper acknowledging, for herself and as the late tenant's representative, that no charge of any kind affected the farm called Wickenholt, and that the payment formerly made at Whitsun had been a voluntary gift of his Grace's family. Discontinued. He had the paper with him. He had it folded in his breast pocket, and he took it out and held it down towards her, and that was his mistake, because until he took it out of his pocket, Hester Ray had believed she was merely in the right, and after he took it out of his pocket, she knew that he was frightened. She did not touch it. She said, in front of the two women at the pump, that the bread was not her father's gift, and it was not hers to sign away, that it belonged to 62 households in that parish, and to every household that should come after them, forever, and that Mr. Sennick might have her answer at the porch at noon on Whitsun Monday, where the board said the money was to be paid. Then she curtsied to him, properly, the way her mother had taught her to curtsy to gentlefolk when she was 6 years old, and went back inside. He was as good as his word about the rest of it. Mrs. Kerridge held her shop and the room and a half above it of the Ambersley estate, on a yearly holding no better than the Rays had held Wickenholt, and on the Thursday of that week, the estate's under-agent called on her about the state of her back roof, and on the Saturday Anne Ray's bed came down the outside stair for the second time in a fortnight, and went across the street on a handcart to the loft over Nathan Ruddock's wheelwright's shop, where it stayed. Nobody in Bramford said an unkind word to Hester Ray. Nobody would look at her in the street either, except Ruddock and the clerk and the poorest 20 households in the place, who had nothing to lose, and who from the middle of April onwards began leaving things on the step of the wheelwright's shop at night. A dozen eggs, a jug of milk, a bundle of kindling, once a pair of boots that fitted her mother. The one thing she never afterwards spoke about was the tally book. On the 21st of April, at 9 at night, a man came up the outside stair of the wheelwright's shop and knocked, and it was Owen Tarrant, who was 30 years old and had been the estate's own surveyor and measurer for 6 years, a long, quiet, dark man with a countryman's hands and a decent coat, and who had, on the 4th of the month, gone out to Wickenholt with a chain and a book to value the dilapidations, and had written down that there was no dilapidation, the wall being sound and the hedge laid in the 5th year by agreement, and had been told to write it again differently, and had refused. He had cleared his desk at the estate office that afternoon. Under his coat he had a small oblong book bound in sheepskin, with a strap round it, the tally book of the Wickenholt bread, 91 years of it in 4 hands, every household, every loaf, every Whitsun Monday, which had lived in the farm office at the court, since the last tenant but one had left it there, and which he had been directed that morning, along with 200 weight of other useless old parish stuff, to burn. Whitsun Monday fell that year on the 22nd of May, and it was a beautiful day, hot by 10, with the May still out along the brook, and the whole parish smelling of it. At 11:30 Hester Ray came down Bramford Street, pushing the Wickenholt handcart, which Ruddock had mended for her, and paint, and on the handcart were the 2 long willow baskets that had carried the bread for 91 years, and both baskets were empty. She had thought about that for a fortnight. She could have begged the flour. There were 20 households in that parish who would have gone without their own dinner to fill those baskets, and she knew it. And Nathan Ruddock offered her the money outright and was refused. Because the point of the day was not that the poor of Bramfold should eat. The point of the day was that at noon on Whitsun Monday, at that porch and on no other day, the estate of the Duke of Ambersley was required to pay $31, and if she filled the baskets herself, the estate would say afterwards, and would go on saying for 30 years, that the bread had been given and the parish had taken no harm. So the baskets stood on the step in the sun, empty, with their lids folded back, and everybody who came up the path had to walk past them. They came from 11 o'clock onwards. Widow Stallard came, and Pargeter the blind man on his sister's arm, and old Trant with the parish book and a portable inkhorn, and Mrs. Kerridge, who had a great deal to lose, and came anyway, and stood at the back with her arms folded. Misty Lydiard came out of the vicarage at 20 minutes to 12 and walked up and down inside his own churchyard wall for a while where they could all see him, and then came in and stood in the porch with his hands behind him, and did not go away again. There were, when Simon Trant counted the heads at noon, 144 people in the churchyard of Bramfold on a Monday in haytime, which is to say every soul in that parish who did not hold their bread of the court, and a good many who did. Nobody made a speech. That was the strange thing about it, and the thing that made it unanswerable afterwards. Nathan Ruddock read the board out loud from where it hung, once, all the way through including the date and the name of the second duke, and then the parish waited. The church clock at Bramfold was 9 minutes fast, and always had been, so they waited for it to strike, and then went on waiting 9 minutes more, and a lark went up out of the glebe field, and a wagon went by on the top road, and at about 12:15 the estate's gig came along the top road too, at a trot, with Mr. Josiah Sennick sitting up in it in his black coat, and it did not slow down, and it did not stop, and every face in that churchyard turned and watched it go along the wall and out of sight towards the county town. He had chosen to drive past. He could have gone round by the mill, and nobody would have seen him at all. Hester Ray watched the top of the gig go along above the churchyard wall, and understood exactly what it meant, and was glad of it, because a man who has to drive past to show you he is not stopping has already begun to lose. They stayed until 2 o'clock. At 2, Simon Trant sat down on the stone bench with the churchwarden's book open on his knees, and wrote the entry in the same words the parish had used since the reign of King William, and then wrote what had to be written under it. Whitsun Monday, the 22nd day of May, 1820. Attended at the porch from 11 of the clock until 2. The baskets set out empty. No money paid, tendered or sent by His Grace's estate, and no person attending on its behalf. This being the 8th Whitsun, so failed. Then, because Ruddock had thought of it in the night, everybody in that churchyard who could write came up one at a time and put their name under it, and those who could not write put a cross and had their name written beside it by the clerk, and when it was done there were 144 names on 2.5 pages of the churchwarden's accounts of the parish of Bramfold, with the vicars at the head of them, because Ruddock had walked over and put the pen into his hand in front of everybody, and Mr. Lydiard had not been able to refuse it. and underneath all of it Simon Trant ruled a line and wrote the date on which, by the words on the board, the parish's right of entry upon the farm called Wickenholt would fall due and become lawful, the space of 40 days next after Whitsun Monday, which was the first day of July. There were 40 days to get through, and no money to get through them on. So on the 24th of May, Hester Ray walked up to the home farm at 5 in the morning with a rake over her shoulder and hired herself to the Duke of Ambersley's bailiff as a day labourer in the hay at 1 shilling a day, and was taken on, because the bailiff was short of hands and because she was the best worker in that valley, and he knew it. For 5 weeks she mowed and turned and cocked hay in the fields she had ploughed the winter before last, under the hedge her father had laid, and went home at 8 at night to a loft over a wheelwright's shop, and never once asked to go inside the house. Twice the Duke rode across the bottom ground with company and passed within 30 feet of her, and did not know her, because a woman in a coarse gown with a hat tied down over her ears in a hayfield is not a person to a man on a horse. She is part of the weather. The second time, one of the gentlemen with him said that the crop was uncommonly heavy, and the Duke said that he had taken the farm into his own hand in the spring, and meant to show the county what could be done with it. And they rode on. She had her back to them the whole time, and she did not stop raking. The other thing she did in those 40 days was the thing that finished it. On the 14th of June, at a public sitting in the long room of the George at the county town, the gentlemen appointed by Parliament to inquire concerning the charities of England opened their books upon that county, and Mr. Bellinger, their secretary, gave notice that any person having knowledge of a charity in any parish might attend and be heard. Owen Tarrant read the notice in the newspaper on the Friday, and walked 11 miles to Bramford to put it into Nathan Ruddock's hand. They took the board down off the wall of the porch on the Monday morning. It took 4 men, and they carried it out flat and roped it onto Hedger's wagon with 2 sacks of chaff under it, and drove it 12 miles into the county town at a foot pace, with old Simon Trant sitting up beside it, holding the 7th volume of the churchwarden's accounts on his knees, and half the children of the parish following as far as the turnpike gate. It is not every day that a parish carries its own evidence through the streets of a county town on a wagon. By the time they got to the George, there were perhaps 300 people in the yard, and the board was lifted down and set up against the wall of the long room under the windows, 5 feet by 4, black and gold, and 129 years old, where every gentleman in that room could read the whole of it from where he sat. The Duke of Ambersley did not attend. Miss Sennick attended, with a King's Counsel from the circuit named Mr. Falconer, and Mr. Falconer's argument occupied 50 minutes, and it was, in substance, a very good argument. He said that no deed had been produced. He said that the muniment room at Ambersley Court had burned in 1776, with the office copy of the enrolment in it, that nothing whatever remained but a painted board of unknown authorship and a series of entries in the private books of a parish, and that without the instrument itself no charge could be fastened upon 311 acres of his Grace's freehold. He said twice that a board is not a deed, and Mr. Bellinger's chairman let him finish, and then asked Nathan Ruddock how long the board had hung in the porch, and Ruddock said, "Since 1691, sir, and it was cleaned and gone over in 1788, and the churchwarden's book has the bill for the gold leaf. And the chairman asked how many years the money had been paid, and old Simon Trant opened the 7th volume at the leather marker, and said, 121, sir, in 11 hands, and I have written the last 40 of them myself. And the chairman asked who had received the bread, and half the poor of Bramfold stood up along the back wall of the long room of the George without being asked to, and Widow Dance said that she had had a loaf of it in her hand every Whitsun Monday of her life until the year the estate stopped it, and that her mother had, and that her mother's mother had. And Mr. Falconer sat down and did not ask her a single question, because there was no question to ask. The certificate came down to Bramfold on the 27th of June in an envelope with a seal on it, and Mr. Lydiard opened it in the vestry with both churchwardens present and read it aloud in a voice that got steadier as it went along. The gentleman appointed by Parliament certified that the charity commonly called the Wickenholt Bread in the parish of Bramfold was an ancient charity duly established by the gift of Simon, 2nd Duke of Ambersley, that where the instrument itself is lost, a table of benefactions publicly exhibited in the church, together with usage proved without a break for 121 years, is evidence of the gift and of its terms, that the yearly sum of $31 charged upon the farm called Wickenholt had been withheld for 8 successive Whitsuns, and that the vicar and churchwardens of the said parish were the trustees of it, and were required by the terms of the gift to enforce it, and would answer for the consequences if they did not. That last clause was Mr. Bellinger's own, and it was aimed at exactly one man, and it hit him. Mr. Lydiard folded the certificate up small and put it in his waistcoat, and said that he would be at the gate of Wickenholt at 8 o'clock on Saturday morning. Meanwhile, across the brook, the whole of the home farm was being got ready for the 1st of July, and it had nothing to do with the parish, and that was the beauty of it. The Duke of Ambersley had been to the great sheep shearings in the eastern counties 3 years running as somebody else's guest, and had told Mr. Sennick that when Wickenholt fell in, he would hold a meeting of his own. The cards had gone out at Easter. 216 gentlemen were invited to the Ambersley meeting on the 1st day of July, 1820, to see the new fold yard, the new 8-bay barn with the iron pillars, and the improved stock of a farm taken in hand by its owner, with a cold dinner in a marquee at 2 o'clock, and his Grace in the chair. There were 4 tents up in the stackyard by the Tuesday, a temporary road laid across the paddock with 200 loads of gravel, flags on poles along the drive, and 40 extra men hired out of 3 parishes, and the Duke went round the whole of it twice a day on foot, with his hands behind his back and his hat pushed back, happier than his own people had seen him in 10 years. Because it was the first thing in his life he had made instead of inherited. Mr. Josiah Sennick worked out what the clause of entry meant on the 28th of June in the estate office alone at about 9 at night. He worked it out because he was a careful man, and because he had at last got hold of a full copy of the words on the board, and had sat down to read them the way he read everything, with a ruler under each line. And when he came the second time to the words upon Whitsun Monday, and upon no other day, he stopped and read the last sentence again, and then got up and stood at the window for a long while. On the 29th of June, at 11 in the morning, the estate's junior clerk came into Bramfold on a horse with a canvas bag containing $248 in gold and silver, being 8 years of $31, and a receipt already written out for the vicar's signature, and he was sent from the vicarage to the wheelwright's shop, and from the wheelwright's shop to the churchyard, where he found Nathan Ruddock and old Simon Trant and Hester Ray standing in the porch with the board back up on its wall behind them, and he set the bag down on the stone bench and asked for the receipt to be signed. And Nathan Ruddock did not touch the bag. He said, "Young man, take it back." He said, "The money is payable at this porch upon Whitsun Monday, and upon no other day, and this is a Thursday." He said that the arrears could not be paid in a bag in June, because the gift is not money. The gift is bread and firing, given at that door before the face of the parish on the day named. And 8 Whitsun Mondays that are gone cannot be given back on a Thursday, and there is only one Whitsun Monday in a year. The clerk said that he did not understand. Old Simon Trant, who was 81 and had been waiting his whole life to say something of the kind, told him kindly that it did not matter in the least whether he understood, but that his master had understood it the night before last, and that if he doubted it, he might go home and look at his master's face. The 1st of July, 1820, came up hot and cloudless out of a white mist on the brook. At 7:30, the parish of Bramford began walking up the lane to Wickenholt. Nobody organized it. They came out of their own doors as they were, in working clothes, and fell in behind the handcart, and by the gate of the home farm there were more than 200 of them, because the news had gone round 3 parishes in a night. On the handcart, roped flat and face up so that the gold caught the sun, was the board. The Reverend Mr. Lydiard walked in front of it in his gown and bands, which nobody had asked him to put on. Nathan Ruddock walked on one side of the cart with a spade over his shoulder, and old Simon Trant on the other, with the 7th volume of the churchwarden's accounts held against his chest in both arms. Behind them came Ezra Coop, the parish constable, in his hat, with his staff of office carried upright in his right hand, and beside him a young man in a good coat, with a leather writing case under his arm, who was Mr. Bellinger's junior clerk, sent down from the county town on purpose to see the thing done, and to write down what was said. Hester Ray walked at the back, in the same patched grey gown she had been turned out in, with her mother on her arm, going slowly on the lame hip. Because Anne Ray had said at 6 that morning that she had come down that lane on a chair and she would go up it on her feet. They stopped at the gate of the home farm at 8 o'clock, exactly by the watch in the constable's hand. The Duke's bailiff was standing inside it, with 4 men. He had known Hester since she was a baby, and he told them unhappily that they could not come on, and that his Grace's meeting was that day and the whole county was coming. Constable Coop said that he was there in the King's name to see the peace kept, and nothing broken, and that if any man laid a hand on the vicar of the parish, he would answer for it at the sessions. And then he stood in the open gateway and did not move again for an hour and a half. They lifted the board down off the cart and set it upright against the gatepost, and Nathan Ruddock read it out in the open air to 200 people from beginning to end, slowly, including the name of the second Duke and the date of the deed and the words about the 40 days. Then old Simon Trant opened the 7th volume and read the entry of Whitsun Monday last, and after it, in the same flat parish clerk's voice, the 144 names that were written under it, every one of them, which took 9 minutes, and was the part that people cried at. Then Lydiard, who was 71, and whose hands were shaking so badly that he had to hold the certificate against his chest to read it, read the certificate of the gentleman appointed by Parliament. And then they made the entry, in the old way, because Ruddock had gone into the county town on the Wednesday to be told exactly how it was to be done, and had come back and made his son practice it with him in the shop. Nathan Ruddock stepped through the gateway onto the headland of the field called Church Piece, put his spade into the ground, cut a square turf and lifted it out on the blade, and broke a green twig off the top of the hedge with his right hand. He carried the turf on the blade of the spade and the twig in his hand to the Reverend Mr. Lydiard, who was standing 3 feet inside the gate on his own parish's soil, and put the turf into the vicar's 2 hands and laid the twig on top of it. And Mr. Lydiard, holding a square of earth and a piece of hawthorn against the front of his gown, said, in a voice that carried right down the lane, that he entered upon the farm called Wickenholt, with all its lands, rents, issues, and profits, in the name and to the use of the poor of the parish of Bramfold, by the gift of Simon, 2nd Duke of Ambersley, of the 14th of June, 1691, and that the parish would hold the said farm until every Whitsun withheld should be made good at the church porch, upon Whitsun Monday, and upon no other day, according to the words of the gift. Mr. Bellinger's clerk wrote it all down and noted the hour as 8 minutes and a quarter past 8 in the morning, and at that same moment, half a mile away across the paddock, the first 4 carriages of the Ambersley meeting were coming up the new gravel road between the flags, and there were 340 people already in the stackyard, and the marquee ropes were being tightened, and the Duke of Ambersley was standing in the door of his new 8-bay barn, with a plan in his hand, being congratulated. Mr. Sennick got to the gate at 20 minutes to 9, and the Duke of Ambersley got there at 9, on foot, across the paddock, with about 70 of his own guests behind him, because gentlemen who have come to look at a fold yard will follow anything more interesting. He came through his own gateway and stopped, and looked at the 200 people standing along his hedge, and at the vicar of his own parish holding a square of turf, and at the black and gold board propped against his gatepost with the sun full on it. And he did what nobody at Ambersley Court had done for 8 years, and what everybody in Bramfold had done every Sunday of their lives without seeing it. He read it. He read it standing in front of it with his hat in his hand, in silence, from the first line to the last, and the whole of that lane stood and watched him do it, and it took him rather a long time, because he read the last part twice. Then he said without turning round that the name at the top of it was his own. Mr. Falconer, who had been invited to the meeting as a guest and had come in a nankeen waistcoat expecting a cold dinner, was got up to the gate at a run, and he did what he could, which was not much, standing on a headland in front of 300 people with no papers. He said that the trustees had entered without notice, and old Simon Trant handed him the churchwarden's book open at the entry of the 22nd of May, with 144 names under it, and the date of the 1st of July ruled below them in ink 6 weeks old. He said that the estate had tendered the arrears. Nathan Ruddock said that the estate had offered a bag of money on a Thursday, that the offer had been refused in front of witnesses, and that the clerk who brought it was standing in the crowd and might be asked. He said that the parish must go to Chancery. Mr. Bellinger's clerk observed politely that the parish was already upon the land. That possession, under the words of an ancient gift, is a great deal easier to keep than to obtain, and that his masters would be reporting the whole matter to Parliament in the autumn either way. And then Mr. Falconer asked the only question that mattered. And he asked it of the vicar, quite quietly, and everybody leaned in to hear the answer. He asked for how long the parish said it was entitled to hold the farm. And Mr. Lydiard, who had spent 34 years being careful, put the turf down on the gate-post and answered him in 11 words. Until every Whitsun withheld is made good, upon Whitsun Monday. Miss, Falconer said, that is one payment. And Ruddock said, no, sir, that is 8 payments, and there is one Whitsun Monday in a year. There was a silence in that lane about 4 seconds long, while 300 educated men did the same piece of arithmetic at the same time. And then a noise went through the crowd that people in that parish were still describing 40 years afterwards, because a great many of the men standing on that headland were landlords themselves, and every one of them understood at once that he was looking at his own muniment room. 8 Whitsuns had been withheld. 8 Whitsuns could only be made good one at a time, on the day named and on no other day, because those were the words the second Duke had chosen in 1691, and he had chosen them, plainly, so that no descendant of his could ever settle the debt with a cheque and be rid of the parish in an afternoon. Until the 8th of them was given at that porch, the vicar and churchwardens of Bramfold were entitled to enter upon Wickenholt, and to take its rents, issues and profits. The farm had been let for $620 a year. 8 years of it came to $4,960, and the standing hay, and the wheat in the bottom ground, and the new 8-bay barn that had cost $1,100 in the spring. And it had all come out of $31 a year, saved 8 times, which is $248 in total, ruled through with a pen in the summer of 1812 by a careful man who could not find a covenant to support it. The Duke of Ambersley turned round to Mr. Sennick and asked him whether it was true that the payment had been stopped in his time and by his hand, and Mr. Sennick said that it was, and that no instrument had been produced, and that he had acted for the good of the estate. And the Duke said, and there is no record in this parish of it. And Mr. Sennick said, only the board, your grace. And his grace the Duke of Ambersley stood in the gateway of his own home farm on the finest morning of that summer, with the flags going in the wind behind him, and 340 gentlemen of that county waiting for their dinner in his marquee, and said in a perfectly level voice that the board had been there since before either of them was born. He asked one more question before he went back across the paddock to his guests. He looked down the lane at the 200 people standing along his hedge, and at the young woman at the back of them in a patched grey gown, with an old lame woman on her arm, and he said, out of pure habit, who is the woman? And then he heard himself say it, and stopped, and everybody who was near enough saw him stop. And Mr. Sennick, who had nothing left to lose by then, said, Hester Ray, your grace. Thomas Ray's daughter. She held this farm until the 6th of April, and the Duke of Ambersley looked at her across about 40 feet of his own headland and said her name back, once, and then put his hat on and went to his dinner, and sat at the head of that table for 2 hours, and made a speech of 4 sentences, and defended nothing. The vestry of the parish of Bramford met in the chancel of its own church at 7 in the evening on the 4th of July, with every seat and both aisles full, and people standing in the porch under the board. There was one piece of business. The trustees were in possession of 311 acres, with the hay down and the wheat 3 weeks off harvest, and somebody had to be put into it who could actually farm it, and Mr. Sennick had sent word offering on his Grace's behalf to supply a bailiff from the county town. Nathan Ruddock stood up in his working apron and said that the parish was very much obliged, and that he moved instead that Hester Ray be admitted tenant of the farm called Wickenholt for the term of 8 years certain, at a rent of $620 a year payable to the trustees, and applied for the poor of this parish, she to give the bread at the porch every Whitsun Monday with her own hands as the gift directs, and that the agreement be put in writing and signed, and a counterpart kept in the parish chest. The show of hands was every hand in the church except one, and the one was old Mrs. Pargeter, who was 90, and had not heard the question. Hester Ray walked back up the lane to Wickenholt on the 5th of July, 1820, at 4:30 in the morning, and let herself in at her own kitchen door, and put her hand flat on the long pale scar the table had taken out of the door frame on the way out in April, and then went and looked at the hay, because the hay does not care whose farm it is, and there were 4 days of weather in it. Her mother's chair went back into the house that afternoon on Hedger's wagon, with the chalk mark still on the underside of it, and Anne Ray would never let anybody wash the mark off, and it was still there, faint and blue, when the chair was sold at her own sale 11 years later. The papers were signed in the vestry on the 9th. It was the first written agreement any Ray had ever had for that land in 91 years. And it was 2 pages long, and her name was on it in her own hand, and there is no describing to anybody who has not been turned out of a house what it is to hold a piece of paper with your own name on it, and a term of years in it. She read it every night for a week. She kept it in the tally book under the strap. The estate did not go to Chancery. Mr. Falconer advised against it in writing in the August, in an opinion quoted in 3 counties for years afterwards. His Grace had a very fine case for having the words of the gift construed by a court, and the day that case was opened every landowner in England would learn what was hanging in his own church porch. Mr. Josiah Sennick left Ambersley Court at Michaelmas 1820. He was not turned off. His agreement was simply not renewed. In 8 years he had saved the estate a great deal more than $4,960, and every penny of the ruin came out of the one entry he ruled through, without going to look at the church. The following Whitsun Monday the parish came up the path at 11 o'clock, and the 2 willow baskets were full. There were 62 quartern loaves in them, and the faggots were stacked against the porch wall in bundles of 10. And Hester Ray stood on the 2nd step in a clean gown with the tally book open on the stone bench beside her, and gave the bread out with her own hands, 1 loaf to a house, and 2 to a house with more than 4 children in it. And the old women were served first and sitting down, as the gift directs, before the face of the parish. She gave it 7 more times, once a year, until the 8th Whitsun made the account good, and the trustees gave the farm back to the Duke of Ambersley in 1828, and by then Wickenholt was let to her by his Grace's own agent for 21 years in writing, at a fair rent, which she paid to the day, as her father had. She married Owen Tarrant in the November of 1821, and he measured land for 4 parishes out of that kitchen for 30 years. The Duke came once in the last of the 8 years, and stood at the back of the churchyard, with his hat off, and did not come up the path, and did not speak to anybody, and went home. And the board is still on the wall of that porch, black and gold 5 feet by 4, at the height of a tall man's eyes, where it has hung since 1691, the largest piece of writing in the parish, the plainest, the easiest to read, and the last thing on earth that anybody thought to look at.